The chapel stood in the far corner of the small town, its wooden beams weathered by decades of wind and rain, its stone foundation half swallowed by weeds that crept from the cemetery beside it. To anyone passing through, it looked forgotten, like a relic of another time, when prayers carried more weight and silence inside holy walls meant something more than just emptiness. By 1893, it was already old, though the bell tower still reached stubbornly into the sky, its iron bell dull and cracked from years of use. The doors were heavy oak, the kind that groaned when pulled open, and the glass windows had long since stopped shining. Yet despite its worn state, the chapel remained a place where secrets were whispered, where loneliness lingered, and where something darker seemed to live in the air. People walked past quickly, almost respectfully, but with unease, as if even glancing too long at it would stir something best left untouched. Life in the town itself was simple, or at least it appeared that way. Families worked long days in the fields or in the mills. Children ran barefoot down dirt roads, and Sundays were the only days when everything slowed. On those mornings, bells rang out across the valley, summoning the faithful. But for those without families, for the forgotten children of the orphanage at the edge of town, Sunday was no different than any other day. The orphanage was a gray, imposing building, run with strict rules and even stricter punishments. It was not unusual to hear a child's cries echoing from the halls, quickly silenced by a stern voice or the slam of a door. In a place like that, companionship was rare and trust even rarer. Yet 2 children, both without parents, both without much to hold on to, had found each other. They were quiet souls, shadows in a world that rarely noticed them. They didn't draw attention the way other children did. Instead, they watched. They listened. Their bond was a silent one, born not out of joy, but out of shared loneliness. They carried the kind of sadness that made them seem older than their years, though they were hardly more than children. Life inside the orphanage left little room for softness. Meals were meager, laughter was punished as noise, and kindness came only in rare, fleeting moments. Yet still, in the small glances they exchanged, there was a spark, something fragile, something that tried to survive in a place designed to crush it. The chapel was where they went when they wanted to escape from the world. Nobody followed them there. Perhaps the others were too afraid of the place, of the way the pews seemed to creak even when untouched, or how the shadows gathered thick at the altar. But the children saw it differently. To them, the chapel was quiet, and quiet was rare. It was a place where no one raised their voice. No one struck them across the face for speaking out of turn. The dust on the windows softened the light, making it feel less harsh. The walls, though cracked, gave them a sense of being held, sheltered from the rest of the world. Still, something was unsettling about the chapel, something they both felt but never spoke about. The air inside seemed colder, even on warm days, and their own footsteps echoed back at them as though the building itself was aware of their presence. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing against their small frames, reminding them they were intruding. Sometimes, when the wind passed through the broken bell tower, it made a low, groaning sound, almost like a voice calling down. Yet they kept returning again and again, because anywhere else felt worse. The town itself turned a blind eye to the orphans. They were background figures, tolerated but never embraced, expected to grow into workers without anyone asking what they carried inside. People spoke about morality, about charity, about kindness, but when it came to the children in that orphanage, those words lost their meaning. Power, after all, was not in the hands of the children. It belonged to those who ran the orphanage, those who decided when they ate, when they slept, when they could speak. And it belonged to those who ran the chapel, the ones who claimed to hold answers about salvation, though their actions often told a different story. It was in this fragile balance that the story began, in a year when the town was already uneasy. Whispers traveled in the marketplace about misfortunes, livestock dying without reason, crops failing, families leaving in the middle of the night. People looked for someone to blame, as they always did. The orphanage was an easy target, a place filled with children who didn't belong, who carried no family names to protect them. The chapel, too, was spoken of in hushed tones. Some said it was cursed, others that it was only neglected. But the feeling lingered that something was watching, waiting within its walls. The two children, unaware of how close they were to becoming the center of something far greater than themselves, kept returning to the chapel. Each time, their steps grew bolder, their stays longer. They traced their fingers over the carvings on the pews, whispered secrets beneath the shadow of the altar, and pretended, if only for a few minutes, that they were somewhere safer. But underneath that small rebellion lay a truth neither could name, that in 1893, their lives were heading toward a moment they would not escape. The town would soon remember their names. Not with kindness, not with love, but with a mix of pity and fear. Two orphans who entered the chapel, children who had already lost so much, would be lost once again in a way that would haunt the town long after. And while their footsteps might have faded into silence, the echoes of what happened there never did. The days inside the orphanage dragged on, as if time itself moved more slowly for the children within its walls. Yet for the two who had found each other, there was something different stirring, a pull toward the chapel that grew stronger with every passing week. It was no longer just a place of escape. It became a place of ritual. They went there as if drawn by something unseen, always careful to slip away unnoticed. But people notice more than they admit, and soon whispers began. Other children watched them with narrowed eyes. In a world where scraps of bread and fleeting kindnesses were fought over, even small differences sparked jealousy. Why did those two vanish so often? What did they have that the others did not? They didn't laugh louder, nor did they receive more food or favors, but their bond was enough to stir envy. A few older boys began mocking them, calling them cursed, saying they had made a pact with the shadows in the chapel. At first, it was just taunts, whispered when the caretakers weren't listening. Then came the shoves in the corridors, the stolen blankets, the bruises hidden beneath sleeves. Each act of cruelty hardened them, pushed them closer together, made the chapel seem less like a choice and more like the only refuge they had left. It was in this fragile balance that the story began, in a year when the town was already uneasy. Whispers traveled in the marketplace about misfortunes, livestock dying without reason, crops failing, families leaving in the middle of the night. People looked for someone to blame, as they always did. The orphanage was an easy target, a place filled with children who didn't belong, who carried no family names to protect them. The chapel, too, was spoken of in hushed tones. Some said it was cursed, others that it was only neglected. But the feeling lingered that something was watching, waiting within its walls. The two children, unaware of how close they were to becoming the center of something far greater than themselves, kept returning to the chapel. Each time, their steps grew bolder, their stays longer. They traced their fingers over the carvings on the pews, whispered secrets beneath the shadow of the altar, and pretended, if only for a few minutes, that they were somewhere safer. But underneath that small rebellion lay a truth neither could name, that in 1893, their lives were heading toward a moment they would not escape. The town would soon remember their names. Not with kindness, not with love, but with a mix of pity and fear. Two orphans who entered the chapel, children who had already lost so much, would be lost once again in a way that would haunt the town long after. And while their footsteps might have faded into silence, the echoes of what happened there never did. The days inside the orphanage dragged on, as if time itself moved more slowly for the children within its walls. Yet for the two who had found each other, there was something different stirring, a pull toward the chapel that grew stronger with every passing week. It was no longer just a place of escape. It became a place of ritual. They went there as if drawn by something unseen, always careful to slip away unnoticed. But people notice more than they admit, and soon whispers began. Other children watched them with narrowed eyes. In a world where scraps of bread and fleeting kindnesses were fought over, even small differences sparked jealousy. Why did those two vanish so often? What did they have that the others did not? They didn't laugh louder, nor did they receive more food or favors. But their bond was enough to stir envy. A few older boys began mocking them, calling them cursed, saying they had made a pact with the shadows in the chapel. At first, it was just taunts, whispered when the caretakers weren't listening. Then came the shoves in the corridors, the stolen blankets, the bruises hidden beneath sleeves. Each act of cruelty hardened them, pushed them closer together, made the chapel seem less like a choice and more like the only refuge they had left. Outside the orphanage walls, the town was unraveling in its own way. The year had not been kind. Food was scarce, prices rising. Rumors spread about the mill owner keeping wages low while filling his pockets. People whispered about illness moving through the valley, about the preacher of the chapel hiding more than scripture behind his sermons. The weight of poverty and suspicion pressed down on everyone, but the orphans carried it differently. For them, it was not about losing what they had. It was about never having anything at all. That emptiness gave them a different kind of desperation, one that others mistook for strangeness, even danger. The chapel itself seemed to respond to them as their visits grew bolder. The silence no longer felt like peace, but like a hell breath. They began to notice things they hadn't before. Scratches along the pews that didn't look like normal wear. Faded stains near the altar that the girl insisted weren't from spilled wax. The boy said he sometimes heard faint whispers, too faint to catch the words, when the wind pushed through the broken windows. They never told anyone. If they had, no one would have listened. Instead, they told each other, and each telling drew them closer, even as it deepened the shadows in their minds. The caretakers at the orphanage began to notice their absence. One woman, stern-faced and cold, warned them that wandering off would bring punishment. Another, softer-spoken but sharp in her observations, asked why they always returned with dirt on their shoes, with eyes distant, as though they had been someplace far away. They gave no answers. Their silence only fueled suspicion. Soon, punishments came, long hours of chores, meals withheld, nights forced to kneel on cold floors until their knees ached. Still, when they could, they went back to the chapel. The more they were punished, the more determined they became. Jealousy grew not only among the other children, but among the adults as well. The preacher, who presided over the chapel though services had grown fewer each year, began asking questions about them. He watched them when they attended Sunday prayers, his eyes lingering too long, his voice growing sharp when he spoke of sin and purity. Some said he resented how much time they spent in the chapel, treating it as their own. Others whispered that he had darker reasons, secrets best left unspoken. Whatever the truth, his attention was dangerous, and the children felt it like a shadow stretching toward them. The boy began to change. He grew restless, his temper short, his eyes always flicking toward the windows, as if expecting someone to be watching. He spoke of dreams that woke him in the night, dreams of being locked inside the chapel with no way out, of hearing the bell ring though it hadn't rung in years. The girl tried to soothe him, telling him they were only dreams, but she, too, began to feel the weight pressing down. Sometimes she thought she saw figures standing at the far end of the chapel, unmoving, only to vanish when she blinked. What once felt like escape was now turning into obsession. They no longer went to the chapel just to hide. They went because they felt they had to, because something there called them back again and again. When days passed without a visit, they grew anxious, agitated, snapping at each other, their small fights filled with more venom than before. Then they would return, and the silence of the chapel would swallow their anger whole, leaving them empty and uneasy. The town itself began to look at the children differently. One evening, a farmer claimed he saw them near the graveyard, walking hand in hand long after curfew. He swore their eyes glowed in the moonlight, though others said he had been drinking. Another woman said she heard laughter coming from the chapel at midnight, high-pitched and strange, though she lived too far to know for sure. The gossip spread like fire through dry grass. To a town already strained by hunger and suspicion, the story of two strange orphans haunting the chapel was almost too easy to believe, but the story was not only about fear. For the children, there were quieter struggles, moments when their bond bent under the weight of all they carried. The boy grew protective, sometimes too much so, snapping at anyone who dared speak to the girl. She began to pull away, needing space he could not give. Their small world of two began to feel like a cage, and yet neither could bear the thought of letting go. The chapel, once their sanctuary, had become the very place where their fears and secrets sharpened. It was during one of their visits that they found the book. It was half hidden beneath the altar, its leather cracked, its pages brittle. The writing inside was uneven, some words smudged, others in a language neither recognized. The boy insisted it was important that it was meant for them. The girl felt only dread, but she didn't stop him when he took it with him, hiding it beneath his thin mattress at the orphanage. From that day on, the air around them shifted further. He read it in whispers at night, tracing the strange symbols with his fingers. She begged him to stop, but the more she resisted, the more determined he became. The pressures outside the orphanage deepened as well. The preacher began visiting more often, his sermons sharper, filled with warnings of evil creeping into the town. He mentioned the chapel by name, speaking of it as a place where temptation hid, where sin had taken root. The children sat in silence during these sermons, their hearts pounding as though the words were meant only for them. The other children in the orphanage began to avoid them outright, muttering prayers under their breath when the pair passed by. And yet, through all of it, they clung to each other. Their world was shrinking, pressing in from every side. The punishments, the whispers, the preacher's gaze, the shadows in the chapel itself. The bond that once gave them strength now bound them to something neither could escape. Every choice they made pulled them further into the orbit of that old building, its walls holding not safety, but a gathering storm. By the end of that year, there was no longer any doubt. Something was coming. The chapel no longer waited for them. They were bound to it. Every step they took toward it felt heavier. Every night more restless. Every whisper in the dark more demanding. And though they could not name it, they both knew they were heading toward an end they could not avoid. The night it happened, the sky was heavy with clouds that swallowed the moon whole. Not a star broke through. Not a single line of silver touched the earth. The chapel loomed darker than ever, its crooked frame like the shadow of something skeletal, reaching into the black sky. The two children had slipped out of the orphanage after everyone had gone to sleep, their footsteps muffled against the dirt path. Neither spoke as they moved, though the silence between them was sharp. The boy carried the book under his arm, clutching it so tightly his knuckles turned white. The girl followed, her heart pounding, every instinct inside her begging her to turn back. But she couldn't leave him. She never could. The air inside the chapel was different that night. It was colder, heavier, pressing against their lungs. Their footsteps echoed louder than before, the wood groaning beneath their weight as if warning them away. They made their way to the altar, the boy laying the book upon it with a kind of reverence, his face pale and fevered with determination. He said they needed to finish what they started, that the answers were here. His voice shook, though it was not fear but obsession that carried it. The girl's hands trembled at her sides, her breath uneven. She whispered that they should leave, that the place wasn't safe, but he ignored her, opening the cracked leather cover with a hunger that frightened her more than the chapel itself. The candles he had stolen flickered in the draft, their flames bending as if pulled by something. Unseen. The words on the page, twisted and uneven, seemed to shimmer in the unsteady light. He began to read them aloud, his voice low at first, then louder, his tone growing strange, as if it were not fully his own. The sound filled the chapel, bouncing off the walls, weaving into the silence. The girl covered her ears, begging him to stop, but her voice was drowned out by the echo of his chanting. Then came the sound, a low groan, deep from within the chapel walls, like something ancient waking. The floor beneath them trembled. Dust rained down from the rafters. The boy's eyes went wide, caught between fear and awe, his mouth still moving even as his voice cracked. The girl screamed his name, rushing to him, grabbing his arm. He fought her off, shoving her back so hard she struck the edge of a pew. Pain shot through her, but worse than the pain was the look on his face. It was not the boy she knew. It was someone else, someone consumed by the thing he thought he could control. The air grew thick, choking, as though invisible hands pressed against their throats. The book's pages fluttered wildly despite the stillness of the air. The girl, trembling, forced herself up and lunged forward, slamming the book shut with both hands. The boy snapped, his voice breaking into a scream as he turned on her. His hands wrapped around her shoulders, shaking her, fury spilling from his lips. She saw madness in his eyes, the kind that burns until nothing is left. She pleaded with him, tears streaming, telling him it wasn't too late, that they could still leave. For a moment, his grip loosened, his chest heaving, his face twisting between rage and doubt. Then the bell rang. The sound cracked through the air, violent and wrong. The bell had not rung in years. Its rope cut, its clapper rusted. But that night it thundered from above, shaking the very walls. Both children froze, the sound rattling through their bones. The boy's eyes darted toward the tower, his breath ragged, before he turned back to her with a look she had never seen. It was as though something had claimed him, some force that had been waiting all along to in that moment. He snapped. His hands moved from her shoulders to her throat, pressing hard, harder than she thought possible from someone so small. Panic surged through her. She clawed at his wrists, gasped for air, her vision blurring. Tears burned her eyes as she tried to speak his name, tried to reach the part of him that was still her friend, still the boy who had once held her hand in the dark. But his face was set, his jaw clenched, his eyes empty. The struggle was brutal in its silence. The pews creaked, their wooden edges digging in her back as she fought. Her nails scratched his skin, leaving red lines down his arms, but he didn't stop. The candles flickered wildly, one falling to the ground, its flames sputtering out. Her body weakened, her fight fading, her small hands slipping from his wrists. In a last flicker of her vision, she saw the boy she had once known, if only for a heartbeat. The fear in his eyes, the regret pushing through. But by then it was too late. Her body went still. The boy staggered back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as he looked down at her. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick and suffocating. The chapel seemed to breathe around him, the shadows leaning closer, the air colder than before. The book lay on the altar, closed now, but its presence was undeniable, heavy, as though it had been watching all along. He fell to his knees beside her, his tears falling onto her still face. His breath came in broken sobs, words tumbling from his mouth in gasps. Apologies, prayers, promises that meant nothing now. He shook her, begged her to wake, but the chapel swallowed his cries whole. Panic clawed at him, denial twisting his thoughts. He pressed his hands against her chest, as if he could force her heart to beat again, but nothing came. The truth wrapped itself around him with a grip tighter than his own had been. The bell rang again. This time it was softer, distant, as though it came not from above, but from within the chapel itself. The boy froze, his tears stilling, his body trembling. His eyes darted to the shadows in the corners, where he thought he saw movement, shapes shifting, watching. His mind fractured under the weight of it. Grief, fear, the knowledge of what he had done. He stumbled to his feet, his hands covered in her, his breath sharp and broken. He looked at the doors, but the chapel seemed to stretch, the exit further away than it should have been. In his panic, he turned to the altar, his gaze falling once more on the book. His trembling fingers reached for it, as though it might undo what had happened, as though the words inside could rewrite the night. But when he touched it, the pages shivered on their own, and a gust of air rushed through the chapel, extinguishing the last of the candles. Darkness swallowed everything. His scream echoed long after the silence returned. When the sun rose the next morning, the chapel stood as it always had, silent, crumbling, empty. But inside, the pews bore the marks of the struggle. The altar still carried the faint trace of blood, and the book was gone. Neither child was seen again. The town would whisper about it for years. twisting the story into something unrecognizable, some calling it tragedy, others cursing. But the truth remained, locked within the chapel walls, heavy and unyielding, a shadow that never left. The chapel stood silent the next morning, its bell tower leaning as it always had, its doors sealed shut as though nothing inside had changed. But the air in town was different. Word spread before anyone knew who had spoken first. The two orphans were gone. Some swore they had seen the children heading toward the chapel in the dead of night. Others whispered they had heard the bell ringing, though no one had touched it in decades. By midday, the whispers had grown into something heavier, carried across the market square, muttered in kitchens, murmured on porches. 2 children had entered the chapel. None had left. The orphanage was the first to face suspicion. The caretakers, already hardened and defensive, insisted the children had run away, that they had nothing to do with it. They scolded the others for speaking of curses, threatened to whip any child caught spreading tales. But their denials rang hollow, because the truth was that no one trusted them. For years, the town had looked the other way, ignoring the bruises, the hunger, the cries muffled behind locked doors. Now those same townspeople turned their eyes sharply toward the orphanage, wondering if the children's disappearance had been born not of ghosts, but of cruelty. Yet when a group of men pushed open the chapel doors, what they found silenced the questions. The place smelled of smoke and wax, though no candles burned. The pews were scattered, some scarred by deep scratches as if dragged across the floor in chaos. At the altar, the wood was darkened, a faint stain that the men recognized all too well. Blood. There was no body, no sign of the children, no book. Only the silence pressed against them until their nerves broke, and they stumbled back into the daylight, pale and trembling. From then on, the story belonged to the town. It twisted with each telling. Some said the children had killed each other in some desperate act, their bodies taken by whatever force haunted the chapel. Others believed the boy had gone mad, driven by something he had found in that book, and the girl had suffered for it. A few whispered that the preacher himself had lured them there, using the old building for darker purposes. No matter the version, the end was the same. 2 orphans gone, the chapel cursed. The preacher's sermons grew louder after that, filled with fire and warnings. He told the townspeople this was punishment for their sins, that evil had taken root because they had strayed from God's word. But his words only deepened suspicion. Too many remembered how he had watched the children, how his eyes lingered. Too many wondered why the bell had rung when it should not have. His voice thundered from the pulpit, but his congregation thinned, families slipping out of the chapel never to return. By winter, the pews sat nearly empty, the man shouting into silence, sweat glistening on his brow as though he himself was haunted. The townspeople carried the crime like a wound. Parents warned their children to keep away from the chapel, crossing themselves when they passed it. Farmers swore their animals shied from the road near its graveyard. Some swore they saw figures through the broken windows, small shadows that darted out of sight when they drew near. For the other children in the orphanage, fear became routine. At night, they whispered about the missing pair, some saying they had been taken by angels, others saying they wandered still, trapped in the chapel, waiting. The caretakers silenced them with blows, but even they could not sleep without wondering if the building at the edge of town held more than wood and stone. For the boy who had been left behind in that chapel, guilt was no longer something he carried. It was all that he was. In those last moments, before the darkness swallowed him, he had felt the weight of what he had done, and there was no undoing it. His scream had become part of the chapel itself, echoing in the silence long after he was gone. If he lingered not as a child, but as something broken, bound to the place of his crime. For the girl, there was no rest either. Her last breath had not been released, but she struggled, her final thought not peace, but betrayal. And so, if her spirit walked the chapel, it was not in forgiveness, but in sorrow, her presence a reminder of love twisted into violence. The town did not speak of justice because there was none to be found. There was no trial, no law to follow, no body to bury. Instead, there was only memory, 2 names carved quietly into a ledger at the orphanage, 2 empty beds left unclaimed. For those who had known them, even in passing, the loss was sharp in its unfairness. Children were not supposed to vanish into shadows. Yet here, in this place, they had. Years passed, and the story became legend. Children dared each other to approach the chapel, to touch its doors, to listen for the bell. Some claimed they heard laughter from inside, high-pitched and brittle. Others swore they felt a hand brush against theirs, though no one stood beside them. The chapel became a scar on the town, something everyone saw but no one acknowledged, its silence louder than any sermon. The orphanage continued, its halls filled with new faces, though the same harsh rules and cruelty remained. But those who lived through that year carried the story with them. Even the caretakers, for all their coldness, grew quieter, their punishments less sharp, as though some part of them feared the wrath of the lost children still lingered. The preacher faded into obscurity, his words losing power until he, too, was forgotten. But for the town itself, the aftermath never truly ended. The crime, if it could even be called that, left more than grief. It left doubt. It left the question of whether what happened that night was born of human cruelty or of something darker that had always lived within the chapel's walls. For some, the answer mattered. For others, it didn't. What mattered was that 2 children had walked into a place meant to be holy, and none had walked back out. And in the silence that followed, the town learned a truth they never said aloud. Sometimes the evil we fear is not waiting in the shadows, but growing in the hearts of those who are already broken. Time passed, but the story of the 2 orphans never truly left the town. Even as the years wore on and new generations grew, the memory of what happened in 1893 lived quietly in whispers, in a shiver that ran down a spine when someone glanced at the chapel too long, in the way parents warned their children not to wander at night. The truth of that night was never fully known, but the weight of it lingered, shaping the way people saw the chapel, the orphanage, and even themselves. Justice, in its traditional sense, was never served. There are no trials, no judges, no verdicts. The boy who committed the final act disappeared with the girl, swallowed by a force no one could name. He never faced punishment beyond the torment of what he had done in those last moments. And perhaps that was punishment, Ugh, his final cry, echoing inside the chapel, was said to be heard for years after, as if his guilt had bound him tighter than chains ever could. For the girl, there was no justice either. Her life was taken in a moment of desperation, her trust betrayed by the one person who had promised her safety. Her loss was the deepest wound of all, an innocent caught between human frailty and something that defied understanding. The orphanage endured, though never without shadows. The caretakers carried the shame of their neglect, though they never admitted it aloud. Their punishments grew less severe after the incident, as though even their cruelty could be tamed by fear of what might happen if the children under their care suffered too greatly. Still, the system remained broken. The orphans who came after lived the same lives of scarcity, silence, and longing, because in truth, the town had little interest in changing what was easier left ignored. The chapel itself became more than just a building. It became a warning. Families avoided it, its doors rotting, its pews collecting dust. Some wanted it torn down, but fear kept them from acting. To destroy it, they said, would only anger what lived inside. So it stood, a silent monument to what had happened, a reminder of the night when 2 children vanished, and of the darkness that came when innocence met obsession. In that way, the chapel became its own kind of justice, not closure, but memory, forcing the town to confront what they could not forget. The wider town carried the crime in its own way. Some leaned into superstition, using the story as a moral tale for children, proof that sin and disobedience brought ruin. Others looked inward, questioning their own role. They asked why no one had cared for the orphans sooner, why no one had protected them, why loneliness and neglect had been left to fester until it became something deadly. In those quiet reflections, a deeper truth emerged. What happened was not only the fault of one boy in one moment. It was the fault of a community that allowed children to be forgotten, that turned away from suffering until it grew too heavy to bear. This was the crime beneath the crime, the one not written in blood, but in silence. A silence that had been present long before that night in the chapel. One that weighed on every child who grew up in the orphanage, every person who looked away instead of reaching out. The two children were the only ones who carried the silence to its breaking point. In the end, the story revealed more about the town than it did about the children. It showed how fear could twist truth into legend, how guilt could be buried beneath superstition, and how power, whether in the hands of preachers, caretakers, or even desperate children, could turn cruel when unchecked. It forced people to ask where evil truly lived, in the walls of the chapel, or in the choices of those who claimed they had no choice. The themes that grew from the tragedy were not simple. Morality was not clear-cut, for the boy had loved the girl even as he destroyed her. Power was not straightforward, for the orphanage held control over children, but was powerless to protect them from themselves. Justice was not tangible, for there was no law that could touch what had happened inside those walls. What remained instead was reflection on how fragile life is, how quickly trust can fracture, and how human nature can bend under pressure until it breaks. For the town, the story hardened into something like folklore. But beneath the whispers, there was always a quiet unease, a recognition that what happened was not only a ghost story, not only a curse. It was also a mirror. It showed them the price of neglect, the danger of silence, and the consequences of allowing the vulnerable to fend for themselves. It asked questions no sermon could answer, no law could solve. When innocence is left unprotected, what responsibility does a community carry for what follows? When the powerless are abandoned, who is truly guilty? The one who breaks, or the many who allowed the breaking to happen? In that way, the story of the two orphans reached further than the chapel, further than the year 1893. It became a reflection of something universal, something that touches every society. Power without care breeds cruelty. Morality without action is hollow. And justice, when denied to the weak, is no justice at all. The chapel still stood in the corner of the town, long after the details of the night blurred with age. Weeds grew taller, its roof sagged, its windows darkened with dust. No one entered anymore, not even the preacher, long gone to his grave. But sometimes, when the wind was right, when the valley was quiet, the bell was said to ring. Just once. A hollow sound, distant like a reminder. Two children had walked inside, searching for shelter. None had walked back out. And in that single sound, the town remembered. Not just the loss, not just the fear, but the truth of what silence can do.